Here we go. Welcome to Wabash Webinars. I am Nancy Lynn Westfield, Director of the Wabash Center. Harley Hollinsby is our producer and Paul Myrie is our sound engineer. We will be taking questions for our guests during the webinar. If you have questions, please send them to Paul Myrie's email at myhrep@wabash.edu. That's myhrep@wabash.edu. Our conversation today is happening in part because colleagues are asking for better ideas and uses for grants from the Wabash Center. Our guests today have made an excellent use of Wabash grants, so we're here to listen and to learn about how the grants can enrich and promote the projects that are happening in your own context. Specifically today, the grant and their project is about privileging Blackness among predominantly white students. We have colleagues who want to know in specific terms, and that's what our guests will have, about how to better protest in classrooms against white supremacy, the how of making these standards shift and move. My guests today are first, Dr. Mitzi Smith. She is the J. Davison Phillips Professor of New Testament at Columbia Theological Seminary. Welcome, Dr. Smith, to the conversation.
Thank you, Dr. Dr. Westfield. It's great to be here.
And Dr. Dan Ulrich. He is the Wien Professor of New Testament at Bethany Theological Seminary, also a professor and in partnership with Earlham School of Religion. Welcome, Dr. Ulrich, to the conversation.
Thank you, Dr. Westfield and Dr. Smith. It's good to be with you.
So to both of you who were in a project that was in collaboration, we want to know first, describe the project itself to us so the guests know, so the listeners and the viewers know what we're talking about. So Mitzi, go first. Just lay out the project as you all created it.
Yes, so the project, the project centers around a we would call collaborative course on African American interpretation and the Gospel of Luke with a focus on home and homelessness. And the idea was that I would teach this class for the students at Bethany and Earlham at the request of Dr. Ulrich, and also open it for Columbia's students as well. And it was meant to be initially an explorations course whereby Bethany's and Earlham students would come to CTS's campus, and we would also visit to different nonprofits and sites around Atlanta. So with the pandemic, that all changed. And we thought, well, how can we perhaps, what can we do to process or to think about the best ways to teach this course now? To go about this collaboration, to take it online, to still provide this experience in the pandemic. And we thought, well, maybe Wabash will fund a collaboration. And then the thought came, well, what about why don't we sit down with two consultants? And so we chose, Dr. Ulrich and I chose Dr. Mary Hess and Dr. Marcia Riggs, an African American ethicist, and Dr. Hess is a white woman teaching. Forgive me for not remembering her field.
Religious education.
Yes, religious education. I would say education, religious education, yes. And so we were able to meet and talk. We already had the syllabus was done and so forth, because the grant project kind of idea about applying to Wabash came late in the process. And then, of course, you have to process the grant and approve it and editing and so forth. And so we already had a syllabus and so forth, but we had the opportunity to sit down and talk through it and talk about pertinent issues.
So Dr. Ulrich, tell us your recollection of it. So this, I'm not disputing certainly Mitzi's recollection, but describe the project from your perspective, because one of the good things about a collaboration is people have different things that they're getting from and expecting from the collaboration. So talk about the genesis of the collaboration from your side.
Well, I was just delighted when Dr. Smith agreed to teach the students at Bethany and ESR, and we had the opportunity to work on planning the course. It was her course, her teaching, but she really listened to input on what that might be. And as we thought about the grant project, we were not only trying to figure out how to work with building empathy and understanding of homelessness, and figuring out how to help students identify and engage in critical conversation with the text and with African American communities. We also realized that we had our own issues related to race and gender that needed to be worked through. So that was an aspect of the grant that we included in the proposal, and the consultants have helped us work on those as well. So this has been a journey of exploration for me. I've seen it as an opportunity for professional growth that can be really transformative for me as I learn from Mitzi, learn how to privilege Black experience in teaching, and also as I wrestle with my own issues in relation to race and gender, which continue to challenge me. So this has been a really great learning opportunity for me. The blogging has been a really important aspect of it for us. So we each agreed to write blogs, which the Wabash Center has graciously published, and we're continuing to do that. Our consultants have also each written a blog post. And as I've written for that blog, I've found myself reflecting more deeply on my experience and learning a lot from the process of putting those reflections into writing. And also, our consultants and Dr. Smith have engaged with me, and this has gone both ways in a peer review process for the blog. So I think I can certainly affirm that my writing has greatly improved as a result of feedback from colleagues. And so I learned through that process as well. So it's been a tremendous learning opportunity.
So certainly in 2020, maybe especially in 2020, the notion of privileging Blackness among predominantly white students is a provocative, maybe even inflammatory statement. Mitzi, tell us what you mean by that and what you've learned in the conversation.
I think it's important to remember too that when Dr. Ulrich approached me, and he may or may not remember this, but he stated to me, we are in Indiana in a place where we have basically very little diversity. So a big part of it was bringing diversity to them, right? So that is what I would be doing as a professor, not just in terms of the subject matter, but as the professor, right? A Black female teaching these students and teaching African American interpretation. So to center Blackness, right? First of all, to have a Black woman, biblical scholar, the authoritative voice and teacher at the head of the course, right? We found in an online poll that not one student, maybe one student, and it was an African American student from CTS, had been taught by a Black biblical scholar, had never been taught, definitely by a Black woman biblical scholar, had perhaps maybe one or two read or had access to True to Our Native Land, which is an African American commentary of the New Testament that was published in 2007, but otherwise no access, right? And in fact, quite a few of the students, some white, primarily white, and a few Black students, when asked, well, have you read books by Black biblical scholars, would substitute, right, James Cone for as a Black biblical scholar, or Dolores Williams, so that our voices and our bodies become substitutable, right?
Mm-hmm.
And I'm sure there was some angst, right, on some students' part in terms of, and some of them expressed it. I'm nervous, about being in this class with a Black woman biblical scholar, and learning this subject from her, right? And I think it comforted them, right, in some way, to have a white male even though he's not teaching in that space, a white male scholar. I think that was comforting to some of them. But to Dr. Ulrich's credit, he functioned, he positioned himself as a learner, which was the intent, that he entered the course as a learner, and I as the professor of the course.
So they didn't know what they were afraid you were going to do to them, but they were convinced, Mincy, that you were going to do something to them, as if learning is something that is that the relationship between the teacher and the learner is suspect. If you're a Black woman and in a Black woman's body, you're gonna do something to me. That's what I hear you saying in that, in the nervousness of the students and their reaction to you. So there's a syllabus, but yet they're afraid you're gonna do something to them.
Mm-hmm. Perhaps you won't. Okay, how do I want to say? Perhaps you won't treat them well. Perhaps you won't be fair. Perhaps some people's idea of African American interpretation is doing Eurocentric interpretation, but adding a Black voice, a couple of Black voices, or a couple of Black, bringing something from the Black tradition, but doing Eurocentric work, right? So I think there's this nervousness that you won't do that. And of course, I did not do that. Right?
No, there's no reason to do that. There's nothing in that, right? So Dan, help us. Your invitation, which started this whole thing, your invitation. What is it like? The power, it seems to me, the power of inviting people into spaces is not only quite powerful, and then I'm going to use the word humble, and then to humble yourself in front of your students as a learner, that whole package is a very powerful gesture to me, and a gesture of justice.
Well, thank you. I had the feeling that Mitzi was really helping us to engage with her in a way that was courageous for her. She was welcoming me into her teaching space, and that was an important gesture on her part. So I was just delighted when she agreed to help us in that way. And yes, I was positioning myself as a learner and trying to model learning for the students. And I do think that required me to approach the course in a different way than I ordinarily would as a professor, obviously, but also require me to act differently than I had as a student. As I described in one of the blogs, I have a long history of talking a lot in class and being someone who has give and take with the professor, and so I needed to back down from that to listen and to resist the temptation to engage in conversation that would set me up as somehow seeming to compete with Dr. Smith's authority. So that was an aspect of it. I learned so much from the course and from reflecting on the course. I think that interpreting Luke through the lens of home and homelessness is just a brilliant idea on Misty's part. And there were so many wonderful resources to help students engage, even at a distance, with reality of homelessness. So we read Evicted by Matthew Desmond, the Princeton sociologist who spent time in Milwaukee, tracing the stories, living with neighbors who were on the way toward homelessness. And we also had videos like Lost Angels, I Live on Skid Row, and Dark Days, which features folks living in a Amtrak tunnel under Manhattan. These videos were not the same as being face to face with people experiencing homelessness, engaging them ourselves. That would have been a different level of practice, which would have been very helpful. But they were an opportunity to really listen to real people as they told their stories, because of the way those particular videos and the book were developed. So that really helps students engage in I think a deeper level of reflection on how the themes of home and homelessness and the experience in particular of Black communities who predominantly experience the disadvantage in relation to housing discrimination and other factors that lead to homelessness, that this was a really important way to engage with the Gospel of Luke. And over again, my eyes were opened to how Luke addresses the theme of home and homelessness. For example, when Jesus preaches in Nazareth in Luke 4 and is kind of chased out of his hometown, he's becoming homeless. I had not made that connection before, even though I've studied that passage carefully. So this was a learning opportunity for me and for the students. And I think most of our students took great advantage of it.
So Dr. Smith, keep going. How did you experience being in the classroom? How did you experience a colleague there in collaboration, which is a different kind of mode than we're usually in classrooms with our colleagues if we're co-teaching? And how were the students who thought they had signed up to go to a predominantly white school and learn predominantly white Eurocentric thought?
Yes. Let me start with the issue of trust. And so, as a Black woman entering the space, I enter teaching. On the one hand, I enter seeing students as human beings, right? But there's always going to be something that reminds you that you're seen as a Black woman, right? Mm-hmm. There's always something. You never forget that, right? And let me say that Dr. Ulrich and I had never, we did have one meal at SBL after he asked me, right, to do this, but we had never developed a trust relationship, right? And so I'm entering this classroom also wondering, to be honest, is he going to be like some of white males I've experienced before, in terms of feeling that they need to be the dominant voice, or they really, and I expected that some students, especially since they're students at Bethany, would attempt to contact him, in different ways to complain. And so I had to trust that, well, how is he going to handle that? And I had to also, as a Black woman, I think a lot of times when we, a Black woman or man enters a classroom as the authoritative voice, in this setting, where in a primarily white setting, let me say my first 13 years teaching, I taught at a primarily white school, but in a primarily African American center of that school, right? Which is a whole different dynamic, even though, you have white people making choices for the center, right? Without our voices often being included, but the classroom itself was basically African American. So to come here and to do a CTS and to do this, this course with Bethany and Earlham is to be in a different space, where you are very much cognizant of racial dynamics, right? And who is seen and understood as authoritative, the authoritative voice, even in, especially I would say in biblical studies and probably theology too, right? And so I had to sort of position myself mentally to reminding myself, you are a biblical scholar. You know, you bring a lot of experience and expertise, and you are here to do what you have prepared and grown to do. And so I just had to assume that space, right? Even at times when it's challenging, you're not always sure when students are challenging you because of who you are, because a lot of times they are, right? Or because this is just what they do, right? Unfortunately for us, most of the time, if you're dealing with white students, they are going to challenge you because you are a black woman standing there in the biblical studies classroom. That's that's a fact of our experience, right? And so I think initially, once I prepared myself for this experience, I just did not step out of that role in terms of I didn't give up that space, right? I think I like to think I'm always a kind teacher, regardless. But also men and white people and non-black men across race are not always comfortable. Are not comfortable is probably a euphemistic way to say it, with a black woman asserting her authority and taking unapologetically, right? Um, Assuming unapologetically that authoritative role, that authoritative voice as a biblical scholar. So there was, there are probably several examples I could point to, but there's one that stays fresh in my mind is one of the last essays. And let me say, most of what they read, the first three books they had to read were three of my books, right? Insights from African American Interpretation, Womanist, and parts of I Found God in Me. And at some point, I had to say in an email, I was a little apologetic, about using my own text. And Dr. Hess said, do not do that because white men are not in no ways. And I did write them for that. I wrote them because we don't have them in the classroom, right? That I need these books. If no one else uses them, I need them. My students need them, right? And so I wanted them to have, we enter these relationships or we don't do the groundwork. That was my way of making them do the groundwork of reading books they had never read before, right? Before we got to Luke. Right, that you need to know what African American interpretation is. You need to read other readings of other ways that womanists and I have read text before we start reading Luke. And so that was the goal of that. And there were students who were upset, even though the syllabus was available weeks early, who accused me of making them do stuff that they weren't aware of. I'm like, well, so there was always that. But one of the last an article of mine that has not come out yet, will come out early in 2021, but is already been written and peer reviewed, is a reading of the crucifixion of Jesus, right? And I go beyond. I engage James Cone and other works, but I go beyond that, right? I start with my own experience of sexual abuse, and that was new to most of the students in the class, probably 95% to 99% that I start with such a vulnerable, right, story and place, and it helped a lot of students, but some still found it quite troubling, right? And then had the nerve to suggest, right, which Cone has not done. And I asked Angela Sims, had you done this? And why hadn't you all mentioned this in your work? The possibility of more than the possibility that Black lynching victims were castrated, right? So why not mention that? Why is that not a possibility for Jesus and his crucifixion, right? And so that opened there. I had to say that the Black male students and Black students, about 5 and out of a class of I think 22, 23 students who were African American, I didn't readily have a problem with that because it could enter into their historical and their cultural imagination. And this is what I try to get over to some of them. No, you can't see it and you refuse to see it. Maybe part of the reason is because it doesn't enter into your cultural imagination, right? But it does so into mine. And so perhaps you need to think about that. And some people were able to think that and say, yes, I can see that, and even open them up to they started telling their own vulnerable stories in the forums, right? They were in groups of 4 in the discussion forums, 4 or 5 people, and they stayed in those groups through the whole course, and so they developed community and vulnerability with each other, right? And so there was pushback there, and it reminded me somewhat of recent pushback I get at a New Testament colloquium since I've been here, where a white male scholar said to me, "Why do you have to rescue all women?" And so perhaps perhaps some people felt that was doing something similar, right? And so there is. But for most of all, let me say this: it was new to most students. We had different levels of students. We had students for whom this was their first seminary course, and that had its own challenges for me as a professor and for them as students, right? Um, uh, uh, but the overall feedback, and I was glad. Let me say this: I was glad for those for whom it was their first seminary class. And I was asked would I be open to those type of students in the class, and I said definitely, because they start out reading differently. But once you're indoctrinated in seminary to see Blackness and Black bodies and Black culture as peripheral, as marginal, as other, as not important, right? It's difficult, more difficult to reverse that, right? But when you start people early on to reading differently and seeing differently, most of them you can't turn back.
Why? Because that becomes normative in seminary, right? They think, oh, this is what seminary is supposed to do. This is what y'all gonna do to me. Finally, I know what you're going to do to me. But Dr. Mitzi, go back, because I do think younger professors, I appreciate your description of the vulnerability that you brought to your own classroom as a teaching tool. But even in this moment, the vulnerability to disclose as a seasoned teacher, as a scholar who is revered by other biblical scholars, I'm going to say it that strongly, that you still have to think yourself into these dangerous spaces called classrooms. So to say to young scholars, and even those of us who aren't young scholars anymore, we're just old scholars, that you're disclosing that I have to talk myself up to go into these spaces is a very wonderful thing to say, and comforting to me, because many of us would think, well, we're the only ones. At some point, I should get used to this. At some point, I shouldn't have to talk myself up to going into these conversations where you're so objectified, where you're so dehumanized, but we do it anyway. So thank you for that acknowledgement.
Oh, you're welcome. Yeah, definitely. It never stops. Now, coming from Ashland, Detroit, and coming here to CTS, where now I have predominantly white students and very few African Americans. That may change with the reparations document, but position the CTS took recently. But then you have international students who also see themselves who do not align themselves with African Americans and see CCS is another animal. I actually had a student in one of my classes from Bermuda introducing herself saying, we are not, I quote, anything like African Americans. And I had to stop her right there. We're friends now. She actually has me doing little workshops for them. But I said to her, let me stop you. No, first of all, no two people are absolutely different, not the same. And then we moved on from there. But yes, let me say this: as a full tenure professor coming here, I think my first semester here was a big adjustment, like knowing, like going into these predominantly white spaces. That it was, I would go so far as to saying that it was somewhat traumatic, right? And going into spaces where as in, yes, people promote exegesis, but it's promoted in Presbyterian settings differently, right? It's a different way to perform. It is a dominant way of performing whiteness, these exegesis courses. So I had to come here and teach these exegesis courses, and I had to teach them in testaments I had not focused on, right? And to white students who were taking intensive Greek courses, right? With the fall, with the uh, uh, well, let me say, I may not be filtered here, but with the false and deceptive assumption that they can read Greek entering these courses, right? So I'm teaching I'm teaching a Galatians and Acts exegesis course, Greek based. And I know from making the students go around and read, first of all, that was problematic for a Black woman to make them go around the class reading Greek out loud. Thank God that I have an African American dean, not just African American dean, but who knows better, right? And she happened to see me and said, "Yeah, the students are complaining. You have them going around the classroom reading Greek." And she said to them, "Well, that's how I learned." They didn't expect that.
That's how I learned
but
it.
yes, had it been someone else. And so, having to navigate that, to act like they know, but to teach them, but at the same time, try to teach them who didn't want to learn, right? And I know one student, and I'd hear from, there may be two African Americans and other international students, and they would be quiet. They may have been half the class, but they'd be very quiet, and they'd give over, in a sense, in many ways, intellectual space to the white students, which is problematic, right? And
let's bring Dr. Ulrich in.
Sorry.
So,
Yeah.
Dr. Ulrich, help us learn the role that the consultants were playing. So Mary Hess was a consultant, and Marcia Riggs. What role did they play, and what was the benefit of having those conversation partners?
We have met 5 times now for an hour by Zoom, and we've talked over issues that Dr. Smith or I brought to the consultation, and we just had free-flowing interchange where they were able to listen to what was going on and give their reactions and responses, and make suggestions. For example, one of the suggestions early on was that storytelling is really important as students get ready to engage in issues of race, and so more storytelling was incorporated in the design of the course as a result of that conversation. We have also a pattern of getting input from one another, as I said, about the blog posts, and so the consultants have shared their perspectives on that as well. Mm-hmm. So one more meeting is still on tap for this consultation, and we decided to save that until we've had more time to analyze data from the course, not only what students learned as revealed in their projects, but also the survey data that we've collected. So that will be the next step for a kind of final consultation session this fall.
Most of our teaching is so privatized, right? Even if we're co-teaching a class, we rarely have the luxury of continued conversation, continued reflection, a back and forth between you and Dr. Smith, a back and forth between the consultants. Does that back and forth feel like a luxury? Like, what is it so valuable that it needs to be incorporated regularly, or does it feel like this is a particular project for a particular time?
I think the consultations have been really important for this course, given the complex dynamics surrounding race and gender in the course and in our working relationship. To have those additional perspectives present and giving us input and feedback has just been really valuable. And so I would encourage others who are thinking about a grant project that involves complex, challenging issues to consider bringing in additional expertise in the conversation. Um, I think it would have been less rich as a conversation if just the two of us were talking.
To our viewers, you can bring your questions to our guests by emailing Paul Myrie at myhrep@wabash.edu. Send your emails in the form of questions to Paul Myrie at myhrep@wabash.edu. So continuing with Dr. Ulrich, what did you learn?
One thing I learned is that students are eager for challenge. And and so I wouldn't want to characterize them as being not only white, but expecting to have white perspectives in seminary. It was easy to recruit students for this course because students were eager to have the perspective of an African American woman scholar that isn't available in either Bethany or ESR right now. Were they surprised sometimes, even dismayed? Yes, but they were up to the challenge in general, and I felt that they were not making any kind of move to, you might say, triangle me into a conversation that would be resistant to what Dr. Smith was doing. So that just didn't happen. Or when I had conversation with students, I also didn't let it happen. I'll just say
you
that.
diffused it when
yes,
they, when
yeah,
they,
yeah. So that's one thing I learned. I learned that it's really important for biblical scholars to prioritize the experience of Black communities. That when we begin first by listening to the issues and experiences of Black communities, and then bring that discussion and that learning into conversation with Scripture, the interpretation of Scripture is far richer, and we can understand it at a deeper level. So it's a matter of understanding the text better that requires this kind of intercontextual conversation. But even more than understanding the text better, it's important to be acting at this time. Always it's important to be acting for justice in the world, but how much more right now? It's so urgent that we engage in biblical texts in ways that challenge interpretations that perpetuate injustice and promote interpretations that lead to life-giving communities and justice and fairness, and to actually act on those interpretations as we live in the world. If we're not doing that as educators or as Christians, then we're really missing out on what the Spirit is calling us to do in our vocations. So I'm feeling a deeper commitment to engage fully and assertively in speaking out and acting for justice out of this experience. And I'm also seeing the need to continue work on issues of race and gender, and to work with my colleagues at Bethany and ESR on those issues as well. So I've learned how much I need to learn, as well as having learned some as well in this time. And so I really have benefited from this experience, and will continue to, I think.
my grandfather used to say, the more you know, the more you need to, the more you know, the more you know
Yes.
you need to
Right.
know.
Right.
And that's what I heard you just say, that that this has opened up what I don't know. which is not an indictment
Mhm.
of you as much as it is to spark your curiosity to continue to learn, to continue to be passionate about what you know and how you teach what you know. Dr. Paul Myrie, I'm going to you for questions. Are there any questions from our audience?
There are questions. I'm going to pick this one. I think it connects with what you're just talking about. In what ways did the white students in particular resonate with your teaching? And in what ways did they find it difficult for them to embrace?
Dr. Smith, that sounds like a Dr. Smith question. We'll also go to Dr.
Yeah.
Ulrich.
So I was looking, we did a poll. We did a, Dr. Ulrich and I, together with our consultants, also prepared our own evaluation form for students to fill out after they finish the course. Students, I think learning to use a contemporary justice lens, that was the thing that students really, I think, picked up. It's always difficult. I found even just teaching traditional exegesis for students to learn to read a text in its literary context. That is a skill that you continue to develop, but they really loved reading the text and being surprised by the many different ways one can read when one reads through a particular lens. I mean, at one point, students asked me, "Can we do this just with Luke or with any book of the Bible?" I'm like, with any book of the Bible. It matters what lens you intentionally bring to the reading project, and they really picked that up well, and they loved it. I have one student, his first semester, he's a CTS student, a young white male, identifies as queer, and he's preparing his paper to present that he wrote in this class to present as a first year seminary student, first class seminary student, to present at the regional a regional meeting of the SBL. And so they said that they learned to better raise questions, right? One student said, "I've written," and I'm looking at this, what they've written, "I've written many papers in seminary, but I've never delved quite as deep into the biblical text as I did for this paper." Right. So they learn to ask different questions, to look closer at the scripture, to look deeply, and to look differently.
So Dr. You mentioned just as we were talking, and that's why Paul brought this question, that for white people or people who are moving out of a white normativity to switch lenses, this is what Dr. Mincy is talking about, is new, right? That's a new way to go about learning. That's a new way to go about being a student. That's a new way. So what insights did you get from witnessing your students learn that new thing, do that new thing?
That's a good question. I sense that students were challenged, but also really able, especially those who had more experience. The first time students were a little more challenged to do this, but we're really able to begin with listening to Black experience in light of the excellent resources that Dr. Smith had them read and view. Not perfect, but they had the kind of help that they needed. And so it helped that they were held accountable through quizzes and other structures to actually do this preliminary exploratory work. It certainly helped that they had done their own storytelling and touched on issues of race and that in the preliminary work for the course. But I think what I sense is that a well-planned exploration and integration of the, the experiences of African American interpreters with their own reading and with the discussion in class really can move students forward in this new thing, and it was new for most of them.
Were there aha moments that you could witness or that you remember? I mean, maybe not, but one of the things I find really refreshing, this is also to Dr. Smith, is when you can witness students literally saying, "Oh, I see."
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
For me, I think they happen throughout the course, right? So we had group work. They had discussion forums in Moodle, but we also had group work in Zoom, right? I would put them indiscriminately into groups each time, so the groups were different. And they loved that time together, and they had an assignment each time. Sometimes they annotated, and they were, aha moments like, I didn't know, I've never
That's
seen
the
this
phrase.
before.
That's right.
I've never
That's the
seen this
phrase.
before.
Yep.
I didn't know I could come up with this many questions. I didn't know, so those type of things continually happen, right? And I've never seen home here. I've never seen this is homeless. Just continually using that lens, but continually, from what I saw, new revelations, right? New ways of looking at the scripture, seeing things you would not have seen had you not been using these lenses.
So I, as an African American woman, I take the risk of going into these dangerous spaces the way Dr. Mitzi, you were describing, because for me, the payoff is the aha. When I can witness students saying, I get it. I never saw it like that before. Those to me are transformative moments that it feels like, I'm going to, from my tradition, is the move of the Holy Spirit, nothing less than the move of the Holy Spirit. So I just feel so humbled and just a sense of worthwhileness to make these risks, to do this kind of work for those moments that are transformative, and then hoping when they then go to their families, their churches, their communities, that they take those ahas with them rather than saying, I thought that in the class and now I'm going to discard that.
Yes. I mean, we had students in these comments that say, now I'm looking, I know how to look at secondary characters now, for example, right? I know how to use scripture to work for people. And not to establish the Bible as some rule book now, right? So we got quite a bit of feedback in terms of what this meant for them. One student emailed me and said this was a first seminary class. This was an amazing way. He said, I wasn't sure about in this pandemic starting seminary, but this was an amazing way to start seminary. And I say, these courses are usually elective courses, right? Our courses, African American Womanist are elective courses, and Womanist interpretation, even when people have Black church studies courses, are usually relegated to the margin, even in Black church studies programs.
That's right.
They are elective. These courses should be core courses.
Yep. Well, and I still say the dimension of Dr. Smith teaching and Dr. Ulrich being in the space is a whole new facet of what is being modeled for students, what they're learning from that modeling, and how they understand what is being taught on all of those levels. Dr. Myrie, another question?
Here's one. Having grown up among Navajo people, I think often about what whiteness means in different places and among those whose experiences are varied in the face of whiteness. How do the presenters offer that we might privilege the experience and realities of those who are not Black, but likewise are oppressed by whiteness?
One of the guest speakers we had scholars was Dr. Luis Menendez Acuña, Antunya. He is an assistant New Testament professor at Boston School of Theology. He is not African American, but he writes privileging the Black experience and Blackness. And I asked him when he spoke to the class, I asked him, I said, now you don't identify as Black, correct? He said, correct. So can you explain why or how you do this? And his, I want to misrepresent him, but his response is because I want to be on the right side of justice. And this is a justice issue to privilege Blackness, to privilege justice and injustice, right? And so, one thing that we attempt to do is raise people, or at least that's my goal, is to raise people's consciousness, whether you're Black, white, brown, or whatever, is to raise people's consciousness. People who are religious, people who value the Bible as a sacred text and authoritative text, right? But to raise their consciousness about what is happening in the world, and to bring it to the forefront instead of privileging the ancient text, right? And so we can privilege by making whatever it is we think needs to be brought to the fore and privileged, making that the lens for reading the Bible. I hope I responded appropriately or to that question.
May I add that while we focus this course on Black experience, students were learning skills that will allow them to privilege other communities and listen well to other communities that are oppressed and marginalized. So we needed to focus this course in a particular way. But I do think that once students gain the kinds of skills, interpretive moves that we were modeling and teaching, that Dr. Smith was teaching, and I was modeling by listening, that we can in fact help students make those similar moves with other communities.
Mm-hmm.
That are also as complex. So it's not one size fit all.
Right.
It's not
yes.
take out African Americans and plop in Native Americans
Exactly.
as if it's one kind of Native American.
Exactly.
But it's a model of integrity.
Yes.
Go ahead, Dr.
Right.
Smith.
No, I was going to say, Blackness is not monolithic, right? Just because they've heard me, read myself, I represent one view, right? And I'm continually growing and changing and so forth. And so, so even Blackness is not monolithic. It's complex too, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so, yes, whatever it is you feel that you want to center it, right? Center it.
I used to teach Anne Wimberly's book on African American storytelling. That's not quite the title. And students used to always ask, white students would say, but we're not African American, how can we use this method? I'm like, that doesn't make any sense. It doesn't make any sense. I said, ask me that question at the end of the course, right? Then we'll see. Then we'll figure it out together. Paul, next question.
There's a number of questions circling around the question of students continuing to grow after the course, or what ways did you help kind of set the stage for them to continue to learn and examine their own perspectives on race and white normativity, white privilege, white supremacy? And related to that would be the question around other faculty at your respective schools and the students' expectations for them as a consequence of going through your course.
Those are huge questions, right? So one of the things I hear in that question is the student of agency, the question of agency, that the agency that students received, learned, were given as a tool. How do we as faculty and curriculum designers, like whole designers of entire experiences, ensure that students continue to have agency around issues of injustice.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know if I would put that on one course, but I certainly, all of us that have responsibilities in our faculties, you know, as faculty members and designers of curriculum. So much of our teaching is not about giving students agency.
Mm-hmm.
So talk a little bit about student agency, and is that what we should be doing around these issues of justice or injustice? Many people would disagree with that, would contest the fact that we're not supposed to be giving them agency.
Yeah, so even before this, I've always thought that I'm teaching to give students agency, right? To recognize that you have a voice, to build confidence in your ability to interpret for yourself, right? And not depend on other people, even me, right? To interpret for you, to learn to read closely for yourself, to learn to read differently by engaging with other people who are reading differently. To learn to, and I saw that there was so much creativity. I think Dr. Ulrich can speak to this too. There's so much creativity that I was proud of that came out of this course. They wrote blogs too. There may have been a lot of writing, but they wrote blogs too. They wrote a final paper and they wrote blogs too. And I was just so amazed of those who took up their agency and wrote creatively, right? Wrote differently. And so to me, that's what teaching is all about, is helping students develop their own agency instead of relying on other people to tell them how to interpret, how they should interpret certain texts.
That's all very helpful. I think that we did encourage students to continue their learning. And I think that the next step might be to take initiative to reach out to folks who are experiencing oppression of various kinds, including possibly homelessness. Given the situation with COVID-19, we did not ask students to engage face-to-face with people experiencing homelessness in this course. I think in another iteration, it might be possible to do that, and that would be an important skill development process that would be useful going forward. I hope that students will, in the rest of their curricula in the two schools, be working at ministry formation or contextual education projects that engage them in further learning in terms of connecting with the stories of people that they can then integrate with or bring into dialogue with their readings of scripture. And I think that we are hearing from students that this is something that they're eager to continue learning about. And so I do think that that kind of work of encouraging ongoing learning occurred, even though it might have occurred in another way in a different situation, different course.
Well, and there's only so much burden you can put on one course, right?
Exactly. Yes.
Right.
It matters what the institution does. And I have to say here at Columbia that my colleagues are committed to justice and doing differently. My colleagues in Bible, my colleagues and across the disciplines and religious studies here. That is, so I think it will be, I can only speak for this institution. It will be reinforced, in different courses.
Dr. Smith and Dr. Ulrich, your work and your words and your reflection are inspirational. I thank you for the collaboration that you have created, for the kind of work that you've done and now told many more people about. We want to encourage our viewers to make use of the resources that Wabash Center has to offer, the consultants program, the grants program, the blogs program, that you may or may not want to do something as complex as Dr. Ulrich and Dr. Smith have undertaken, but you may, right? So we are here to support faculty in doing these experiments, these innovations, these new kind of projects, these risky things that seem risky. Dr. Ulrich putting this course forward in his institution was a risky thing that I hope has major payoff for his students, and it sounds like certainly it has. I thank Dr. Smith for her constant courage, right? Her constant courage in doing this work. It is very important work. So thank you both very much. Viewers and listeners, details of all the programming of the Wabash Center is available on our website. If you are interested in any of the programs that you've heard about in terms of what we do as a center, if you want to get on our mailing list, if you want to know about the broadest scope of what we do, all that information is available on our website. I want to thank Carly and Paul. It takes a team to make our webinars happen, our podcasts, our blogs, our consultants program, our grants program. Our team is one of the best around. So thank you, Carly and Paul. And we're out. What a terrific conversation. Thank you both.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for having us.